the deceptions come back, and as it's got more and more complicated, it's actually forced the Russians into a position where I don't think Putin is in a position now where he really understands the reality of what's happening on the ground and the reality of what's happening with his military. Because if he did, he wouldn't have made the decision to go into Ukraine in the first place.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're talking to a former military intelligence officer with more than 26 years experience with the UK Armed Forces. Former Colonel Philip Ingram commanded one military intelligence battalion with unique capabilities to identify and monitor hostile intelligence agencies. And he's now a military analyst and commentator. Philip Ingram, thank you so much for joining us on Frontline.
My pleasure.
Good to have you here today. You're here to talk about information, disinformation and deception. From your reading of the information coming out of Ukraine today, what is the latest on the battlefield?
Well, from an information disinformation perspective, disinformation, or the Russians have got a doctrine which they call Maskirovka, all about masking, all about throwing doubt out there. But it's not just the Russians that are doing it. The Ukrainians are well versed in it as well. And it's being targeted at effects in the battlefield, but also trying to target the populations in each of the different countries, as well as the international community. And it is the single biggest weapon, I think, that the Russians are using against the international community in the way they're doing everything. And this is why we see claims and counterclaims and quick statements that are coming out. And the Russian Ministry of Defense is an expert at it. I whenever I'm commentating, refer to the Russian Ministry of Defense as the Russian Ministry of Disinformation, because most of the time, most of the statements that they put out are deliberately not as truthful as they should be. I'll put it that way. And that's to cause that doubt, that effect.
I'll ask you a bit more about Maskirovka in a moment, but can you just tell us what we can actually establish as actually happening in the war at the moment, the latest developments?
Yeah, in the war at the moment, it's going slowly, as President Zelensky said. But again, this is part of his disinformation campaign. He wants the Russians to think that it is going more slowly than it actually is. The reality is that the Ukrainians, summer last year, wrestled the initiative back from the Russians, having pushed them away from Kyiv, having pushed them to the east, where the Russians had to rechange their main effort into Ukraine. And then Ukraine got a proper tactical regain of the initiative by taking a huge chunk of territory back in Kharkiv in the northeast, and then Kherson later on in the year, and kept that initiative going by fixing the Russians around Bakhmut with all of their attention and a lot of the military effort in there over the winter months, giving the Ukrainians time to take a lot of their best troops out, send them off to the west to be trained on Western pieces of equipment, and then redeploy with that equipment and those trained troops that have been away from the front line for a few months back to carry out this counteroffensive that's going on. And the Ukrainians launched the counteroffensive a couple of months ago. It started slowly with a lot of shaping operations going out into the deep Russian areas, so drones going to Moscow, incursions into Belgorod area, command and control centers blowing up, oil refineries being blown up, attacks against Russian shipping and other bits and pieces. And it's then moved on to the next stage of that, where there's more probing attacks going in on the ground, trying to look at how the Russians have put their defenses out. And they've had 9 months of preparing one of the biggest defensive belts and deliberate defensive operations that we have seen since the Second World War. I don't think we've ever come across anything, any military's ever come across anything so well prepared over such a long period of time. So it's a very difficult obstacle or set of obstacles for the Ukrainians to try and break through. And that's why they're taking their time probing it, looking at it, checking the Russian reactions, trying to get the Russians to deploy their reserve forces out. And whilst they continue to attack into the depth of the Russian areas, destroying ammunition dumps, destroying fuel dumps, attacking lines of communication, which are critical for the Russians moving their ammunition and their troops and their vehicles around. And the two lines of communication they hit are, the main one are rail routes, and then we've got road routes, and we've seen bridges attacked and everything else. So the Counteroffensive is progressing. It's progressing slowly, but I would expect it to be doing that at the moment. There was always this hope that after the rapid regain of certain bits of territory last year that Ukrainians could do that. But I think that hope wasn't based on the reality of what the Russians have got on the ground. And the Ukrainians are keeping their powder dry. They're attacking on 3 or 4 axes at the moment. One north of Bakhmut, attacking in there with some small gains. They're attacking north and south of Bakhmut town itself, and have progressed between 500 meters and 1.5 kilometers in certain areas. It took the Russians 18 months to advance 7 kilometers through Bakhmut to capture most of it. So the Ukrainians are getting some territory back quite well. And then the next attack is just south of the city of Donetsk. And that's their axis, and it's down the sort of the Donetsk, Zaporizhia Oblast border. And in military terms, you always try and find a boundary between things and attack down that. That causes maximum confusion. And then a main effort, I think, is the Ukrainians trying to attack down through Zaporizhia, heading towards a town called Tokmak. And Tokmak is one of those hubs for lines of communication. But if they can attack through there, they'll split this all-important to the Russians land bridge from Crimea up into the Donbass and through into Russia. And at the moment, slow progress, but it's building up that picture of what the Russians are doing and what the defenses are on the ground, so that whenever the Ukrainians do commit their main effort forces, they know that they will have a degree of success rather than just wildly trying to commit them from the outset.
President Zelensky has said that there is evidence of explosives being put on the roof of the Zaporizhia nuclear plant. Is there anything to suggest, and he's blaming the Russians for this, is it possible to verify this?
Well, I think Western intelligence has been repeating that as well. So, I'd take that as close to verification as possible. President Zelensky is getting supported by the West, not just with equipment and ammunition and finances, but also intelligence. And the intelligence capability that's been provided in is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And our imagery analysts will have been examining everything that's going on around Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. The potential for an environmental nuclear disaster is something that will keep all of us occupied, and listening into the communications of the commanders that are around the place. So I think we can say with a degree of probability, high degree of probability, that the Russians have been putting explosives and mining around the Zaporizhia power plant. And again, they did this at the dam across the Dnipro. President Zelensky was saying last autumn that he'd got evidence that the Russians were mining the dam. And we saw what happened to the dam only a few weeks ago. It fits with what the Russians would do. So unfortunately, I think they are mining it.
Information, disinformation, and deception are a common practice in conflict. How decisive can they be as tools of war?
Oh, massively decisive as tools of war. We used to be good at it. If we go back to the Second World War, well, yes. If we go back to the Second World War, Operation Fortitude was the operational name that brought together lots of other operations that convinced Hitler that we were going to attack into Europe through Greece and not through the toe of Italy, and attack through the Pas de Calais and not through Normandy. And that included other operations like Operation Mincemeat, where there was the body of dressed up as a British military major put out of a submarine with most secret plans on it for how some of these attacks were going to go in, knowing that they would fall into the German military intelligence. And we were very good at it during the Second World War. We created a fake army with fake tanks, with fake aircraft, with fake communications, with a real commander, and the Germans believed it. And again, it's nothing new. If we go back to the great ancient Chinese philosopher and general Sun Tzu, in his book The Art of War, he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, all warfare is deception, all deception is warfare. So it is a key part of every conflict. The Russians are masters at it. They have a doctrine called Maskirovka, which is all about masking. It's all about throwing out doubt And in military terms, if you can throw out doubt as to whether you're stronger here or weaker there, you've got this great capability and all the rest of it, it means that the military planners on the other side who are trying to look at countering things are having to try and prove or disprove that information that's out there. And the Russians, even before they reinvaded Ukraine this year, were throwing out lots of Maskirovka. We saw a couple of years ago the new Russian T-14 Armata tank being paraded in Moscow at the May Day parades, and everyone was going on about how that tank was a super tank, could destroy anything the West had got and all the rest of it. The reality is it's not very good at all. It is extremely unreliable. The Russians were trying to get something for their export markets, and it hasn't been proven in combat in the slightest. We for years have been believing that the latest Russian equipments have been an awful lot better than they are, and that's why we've spent more money on more sophisticated weapons to try and attack them. The reality is some of our older weapons, our older missiles, are proving very effective against the most modern Russian tanks in Ukraine. So Maskirovka is something, and disinformation is something that's been going on the battlefield and influencing it the whole way through. And of course, the Russians are doing it. The Ukrainians are in a unique position because they're, from the former Soviet Union. A lot of their psyche is and military training and all the rest of it is former Russian. But they've also been trained and getting their senior staff officers trained in Western staff colleges since the mid 1990s. I remember going through the Advanced Command and Staff course number 1 at it was the old RAF Staff College at Bracknell at the time, and one of my classmates on it was a Ukrainian Air Force officer, and that was back in 1996. So they're in this unique position of having this old Soviet training psyche in what they're doing, and therefore deep understanding, but Western training as well, and they can combine the best of both.
Does that give them an advantage then?
I think it's given them a huge advantage. I think looking what Ukraine is achieving at the moment in reorganizing their complete military, re-equipping their military, whilst fighting a high-intensity conflict against what was on paper, the second best military in the world, and you're having real successes in it, as well as them learning to fight the equipment, all the rest of it. They're having to change their doctrine. They're having to change the way they do it, and to integrate the Western equipment in and to fight it properly. I don't think that's something that certainly we in the UK couldn't do, and I don't think even the US could do that in the way it's done. So they're giving us a masterclass in how to execute high intensity warfare in the modern environment, and that's. I'll caveat that with from a military theoretical perspective, it's absolutely fascinating. But from a human perspective, on the ground, it's horrific, absolutely horrific. And again, it's showing how modern weapons, the horrific impact it has on human beings, and that's why the casualty rates are just so high.
And you said earlier that the Russians are masters at deception. Why are they so good? And can you tell us a bit more about Maskirovka?
Yeah, it's always been part of their psyche. It's something that they've always done because, again, you look at Russia, the biggest country by landmass in the world, one of the smallest, or a relatively small GDP, a relatively small defense budget, but on paper, huge forces. So a lot of what they're doing, a lot of their influence, all the rest of it, is within the information sphere. And again, when it comes to their global political influence. And Vladimir Putin, you grew up through the Russian intelligence agencies. It's all part of his psyche. This you bluffing in what you're doing and keeping the capability going and manipulating thinking and everything else. And he's been doing that to the West from a political perspective all of the time. And he knows which countries that he can wind up by suggesting there's a greater nuclear threat, and he knows which countries he can wind up by getting political influence, and he'll combine his information operations with some of the stuff that's going on in the cyber area, some other things that are happening as well, where you get deliberate physical attacks on things. For example, the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, or some of the undersea communications pipelines that have been cut in different parts of the world, including up around the Shetland Islands and various other things. So it's always been an integral part of Russia's psyche and Russia's operational capability in what they're doing, both from a political perspective out into the international community, from a military perspective and what they're doing on the ground to try and hide things. And it's all about masking and hiding. And from a political perspective into their own population. It's controlling the information sphere in their own population so that they can maintain that level of support for what's going on by making sure that the story that goes out is the one that they have control over, which is why generally the Russian people still support Vladimir Putin's efforts into Ukraine.
And what are the key principles of Maskirovka?
Oh, the key principles of Maskirovka. That's an interesting one. The main thing is to be able to deliver a message that is close to the truth, but not telling the complete truth in many cases, and backing that up with physical evidence if you can. So some of the recent examples of it, I quoted the Second World War example where we had fake tanks and fake aircraft and fake communications because it was designed to bluff the German intelligence gathering and the technical ability of the intelligence gathering at that time, so they would think that this was going on. If we look at other recent examples, the attack on Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury in 2017, part of the reason why Sergei Skripal was attacked was, yes, he was
the Novichok attack in the UK.
That's right, the Novichok attack in the UK. Part of the reason why he was attacked with Novichok was not just because he was in Russian terms, a traitor, an intelligence officer who'd turned and been working for the West, but because he lived in Salisbury. And why was him living in Salisbury so important? It's because as soon as the Russians got accused of it, and they knew that we would identify Novichok at some stage, and therefore it would point directly to the Russians because they're the only ones that had it. So as soon as they were accused of doing that, they could turn around and say, oh, no, it escaped from the British chemical defence establishment at Portendown, just outside Salisbury. And when the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, stood up in Parliament and accused the Russians of carrying out this heinous attack, Vladimir Putin immediately stood up and said, no, it must have escaped from Portendown outside Salisbury. And that was his first bit of masking, throwing people off the scent. But it had the effect that it wanted to, because the then leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, stood up in Parliament and asked the Prime Minister to prove that it hadn't escaped from Portendown. And my vision then was Vladimir Putin was sitting behind his huge oak desk in the Kremlin with a very large glass of best Russian vodka over ice in his best crystal tumbler with a big white cat in his knee going, my job is done for me. Because that doubt is enough to then create a political hiatus to keep a debate going in something, and therefore reduce the effect of any decision making to try and punish Russia for what it did and everything else. And it's the death of a thousand cuts. So again, with Maskirovka, with everything else, there's not one big thing that you do. It's a lot of little interlinked messages and activities that you carry out to have that wider effect. And it has to be carefully planned. It is a deliberately planned operation. It's not something that you just do off the cuff.
How has the Russian use of Maskirovka actually sometimes been detrimental to what the Russians are trying to achieve?
Well, that's very interesting indeed. As Vladimir Putin's been trying to put out, since the and the Russians have been trying to put out since the break up of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and Russia developing and losing a lot of the old Soviet states. Russia's been trying to build this picture to the rest of the world of it being this second largest military, very capable, modern equipment and everything else. And that's where that message has been going out. However, in doing a lot of that, the Russian society is underpinned with a lot of criminal activity. So those that were charged with designing the new tanks, making sure that the stocks in storage were maintained to the right levels and all the rest of it, were using their own Maskirovka as they pocketed the money into their own bank accounts, made themselves very wealthy indeed, and then didn't do anything. But they then go back and tell Vladimir Putin or his predecessors what they wanted to hear, and go, yes, of course, Mr. President, everything is ready and we're getting there. So every element of Russian society has been using that information and passing it up for their effect. And Vladimir Putin almost certainly will have known that's been going on, but won't have wanted to ask the question and drill into it. All he wanted to hear was, yes, this is all working. And then he turns that round and uses that message to go out into the West. So, it's something that has the deceptions come back, and as it's got more and more complicated, it's actually forced the Russians into a position where I don't think Putin is in a position now where he really understands the reality of what's happening on the ground and the reality of what's happening with his military. Because if he did, he wouldn't have made the decision to go into Ukraine in the first place. He believed he was much stronger and much more capable than anything else. His generals wanted to believe that, but some of them knew the reality. But none of them were strong enough to go back and say, "Excuse me, Mr. President, we've got all of our assessments wrong. It's not a good idea to go in because we'll be found wanting." And it's not just confined to the Russians. The same thing has happened to us in different military operations, and I'd argue that's why our activities in Afghanistan and our activities in Iraq turned out to be so disastrous.
So to what lengths does Russia actually go to make its deception credible and to commit to the narrative?
It goes to the complete and ultimate lengths in what it's doing. In that, if you look at the deception that it's putting into the Russian people, the television programs that are put together, the news bulletins that are put together, are putting such a positive spin on everything that's going on in trying to justify their activities into Ukraine. They're bringing in the messaging that they've been using for years, that this is all about NATO expansionism, and the West was trying to get itself in a position to attack the motherland, attack Mother Russia, and therefore we are defending Mother Russia in what we're doing. And it's the elements of truth that are in there. NATO is expanding, but it doesn't do it deliberately to try to defensive alliance. They miss those sorts of little bits and pieces out, so that there's the elements of the truth, but they know the effect that it's going to cause. Our politicians are very good at doing it as well.
Yeah, and having said that, when you've got someone like Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, then basically debunking those ideas, the reasons why Russia went on its special military operation, that must be quite a sledgehammer to the cause and the narrative.
It is. And the Prigozhin coup, if it was a coup attempt, is interesting. There's an awful lot more to come and play out in that. Prigozhin had been openly criticizing the Russian defense minister Shoigu and the Russian commander of all operations into Ukraine, General Gerasimov, for months, and openly criticizing him on his YouTube channels and other social media outlets and everything else. Part of this, and part of what Prigozhin was doing, again, is in the information sphere. You look at the whole front line, and the front line in Ukraine is about 1,200 kilometers long. That's London to Barcelona in length. So it's a very, very big front line. Bakhmut, which is where the Wagner group were focused on, is about 7 kilometers by 7 kilometers. But everything that we were seeing out into the West, and a lot of what was going on into Russian Telegram channels, where people pick up their information, all the rest of it, was from Prigozhin, and it was all about Bakhmut, Wagner, and everyone thought that the whole main effort was Bakhmut and Wagner and everything else, and the rest of the Russian military weren't doing much because it wasn't being reported. That was his information operation in getting that level of support and keeping the focus in there. The Ukrainians were quite happy with that. They reinforced that because that allowed them just to sort of slowly hold the Russians in Bakhmut and get all their troops away to do something else with them. But Prigozhin, I'm in two minds as to what the whole coup attempt was all about. He hasn't, with all this criticism, he hasn't fallen out of a window, which is usually what happens, or decided to have a heart attack next weekend. He's been the only person from Putin's inner circle that has managed to get away with being so openly critical, and nothing's happened to him. And I think the coup attempt was he was going one step too far in his information war against Shoigu, the defense minister, and Gerasimov. He got upset with Shoigu and Gerasimov late last year whenever the defense minister made the decision to replace the general who was in command of operations. That was General Suvorikhin, or his nickname was General Armageddon, who had done a lot in Syria. And Prigozhin and Suvorikhin had worked very closely together in Syria. And he got very upset whenever his friend had been replaced by Gerasimov and then was forced to be his deputy. And he saw that as an insult. And that's, it's internal politics that's going on there. That's probably underpinned by dodgy criminal organized crime deals that are going on as well, that are working things. But now that Prigozhin seems to have been given this lifeline of going and living in Belarus, and I understand from some of the reporting I've read in the last couple of days, his funding that he had has just been released back to him again. He's lost his contracts into the Russian military to provide catering support and all the rest of it. But there's no talk about what's happening to his overseas activities in the Central African Republic and Mozambique and elsewhere, where he's making a fortune in controlling gold, diamonds, hardwood exports and other bits and pieces. But all of that is helping to keep Vladimir Putin's inner circle together. And then there's talk about Prigozhin setting up a military force. And he put a statement out only yesterday talking of opening up a new front and getting involved back into the conflict again. Well, if he's doing that, and he's doing that from Belarus, he'll only be doing that with the cooperation of Vladimir Putin. And he's Putin's prodigy. Putin made him. And if he's doing that with the cooperation of Vladimir Putin, that cooperation is not going to be there. That's something that they've negotiated after this coup attempt. This is all part of a massive charade, potentially. So there's a lot more to come out of it. And we haven't seen, I haven't got any evidence of a lot of the players, the individuals that I've named, where they are, what they're doing, or anything else. I was expecting a night of the long knives where Vladimir Putin was going to go and start to remove some people quite quickly. We've got no evidence of that at the moment. And therefore, I think there's a lot more to play out in this particular one. And it's one I'll be watching with interest for the next few weeks.
I think we all will. From your military experience, in terms of deception, how do different cultures approach it? Or is there a unified kind of concepts?
I don't think there's a unified concept. Whenever you're deceiving, you have to think of things from your opposition's perspective. So some of the best deception things that I've come across in military operations, former Yugoslavia into Kosovo, the Serbs were brilliant at providing deception. And what they do is suggest that bridges have been blown up by spray painting them in different ways, by putting barrels with burning oil in them to get smoke masking on it, and put burned out vehicles on it and other things, so that whenever the NATO Air Force flew over and took their pictures and looked at it, on cursory glance, it would look as if it had been damaged. They knew that our air forces were flying from very high and were looking for Serbian air defense systems, and they realized that the air defense radars had a similar frequency to what you get out of a microwave oven. So they'd take microwave ovens, rip the doors off, tape the micro switch down and switch it on. And the aircraft flying over, their threat warning systems would say, "Oh, that's a threat," and they'd launch $100,000 missile at a $25 microwave oven. I think we destroyed more microwave ovens than anything else. And again, the use of blow up tanks and other bits and pieces, because they knew our aircraft were flying at 25,000 plus feet, and a pilot with his surveillance pod that he had on sees this thing that looks like a tank and drops his bombs on it. And we blew up lots and lots and lots of blow up tanks and other things, because the Serbs understood their deception from our perspective. So within that, you've got the understanding of the culture of the people you're trying to deceive, and you will reinforce some of the beliefs that people have got in that, whether you're deceiving from a political perspective or a military perspective or anything else. And you will do that in multiple different ways that will prick people's senses and make them want to believe the picture that you're painting for them. And that's what it's all about. And we see that today. We see that today in our politics. We look at even politics in the UK. It's politics by soundbite. and the sound bites are presenting a picture of what they believe that their supporters in the electorate want to hear, rather than it necessarily being underpinned by substance. And it may not necessarily be 100% what can be delivered. So it's unfortunately, in today's information age, it is much more prevalent and has a greater effect on us, because we go back to Second World War, and since then, there are a lot fewer media outlets. People had to rely on things that were much more state controlled, so it was easier to control deception and disinformation and propaganda from a state perspective for a wider effect that you have to have. Now, everyone can get a message from anywhere, whenever they want. With social media, we're permanently connected, and people then will tune into channels that they generally like and will listen to. And you whether that's on Telegram or social media or elsewhere. And one of the big problems there is they're not necessarily then getting a balanced view of things. People will tune into a channel they like, and they think, oh, that reinforces what I think, I believe. I like the people who are commenting on all of this. And they don't realize that in many cases they're just getting fed something that's reinforcing their own beliefs. You're not getting that wider debate that there is out there, so that you can start to put things into perspective yourself. But arguably, as a society, do we as individuals have the ability to bring in multiple sources and assess what's going on and make our minds up properly? It's a really difficult task to do. And the Russians know this, the Chinese know this. They are deliberately working ways of trying to influence us. You combine that with what they can scrape from social media and big data, and combine that with artificial intelligence analysis on it, and it gets really scary indeed, because you actually change the way people think.
It sounds to me that if you were to go back to your previous job as a military intelligence officer, it would be a completely different job with completely different challenges to the ones you experienced.
No, not at all. Intelligence, arguably some people call it the second oldest profession. A lot of the tactics, techniques, and procedures from the year dot are still used today. It's all about gathering little bits of information, and trying to build a picture from that. And with that picture that you're building, then make an assessment as to what you think that means, and therefore what could potentially happen in the future. And I liken it to having 100,000 piece jigsaw puzzles. You mix them all up together, and you don't have the box cover of what the final picture would be, or the final pictures that are in there. And you're gathering little bits of information to try and work out where all these pieces get together. So in television terms, you're gathering one element of a color of a pixel at a time, and trying to work out what the overall moving picture is going to be on the television, and then use that to predict what's going to happen in the future. That's why it's really easy, when something has happened, to look back and go, intelligence missed this, we got that. When you've got 20/20 hindsight, you know what the answer is. You've got the picture because something's happened. But whenever you're trying to develop that and predict what's going on in the future, you're expecting intelligence teams to have 20/20 foresight. If everyone who was intelligence had 20/20 foresight, nobody would be working in it. We'd be winning the lottery every weekend. So it's a difficult game. And a lot of the skills are exactly the same as they've always been, even going back to Sun Tzu's time. However, with modern technology and everything else, there are additional set of skills that have to come in, and additional things that you have to use. And when you're gathering information, our interconnected world is something that provides real challenges and real opportunities. And then when you get into and here's where doctrinally a lot of ex-military people are going to come and start shouting at me, offensive intelligence operations, where you're carrying out intelligence operations where you are helping promote that deception because you've worked out what the effect is, and your assessments that you may release out into the public domain may be some that you have spun in a way to get a particular message across. That's something that you have to take into account more and more often.
Do you have a concept, if you take a step back, of how successful or effective offensive intelligence operations have been in Ukraine?
I think they're being quite successful in many areas. I think the Ukrainians are in a fantastic position, as I said, because they've got the Western training and they've got the old Soviet psyche in what they're doing, and understand what the Russians are doing, and that's why they're progressing everything very slowly, very deliberately, and taking great care in what they're doing, and everything else. So they can see the risk and work it. I think we're being manipulated more from a political perspective, in the way the Russians are using scare tactics against us. So we talked about the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. A lot of the reason why that is coming out and coming forward, and the Russians are carrying out activities in there and everything else, is they know that certain countries around the world, and in particular countries in the EU, are terrified about nuclear accidents, because they know that the coalition governments within those countries have got are in a position where the potential environmental threat and the potential threat to their countries and all the rest of it is something that they will play on from a political perspective. And they know that will therefore increase the pressure to try and stop the war, to negotiate, to not give the Ukrainians the weapon systems that they want and everything else. And of course, it suits the Ukrainians whenever they're talking about the threats growing, because they can then use that to try and target the West, to say, keep giving us more weapons, keep giving us the weapons faster, keep doing that. We look at President Zelensky, and it wasn't really disinformation. It's more manipulating the information sphere. If you look at whenever he went round and toured the capitals and toured the United States, and then came into Parliament and then went to Germany, his speech in Parliament, where he talked about having afternoon tea with the speaker and things like that, and he invoked the memories of Winston Churchill. The way he wrote those words were designed to try and manipulate our thinking, and he understood what the British psyche. He understood how to get everyone thinking, this is brilliant, it feels really good supporting Ukraine. He achieved that through the use of information. So it has been critical in the whole conflict so far.
And one of the highest value targets for Russia is a man called General Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence. There are thought to have been several attempts on his life. Can you tell us a bit more about him and about how he's shaping the war effort?
Yeah, but Budanov he's a quiet man, sitting in the background, running a fantastic intelligence operation, not just using his own intelligence assets, but also been able to integrate a lot of things that he will never had exposure to beforehand. The intelligence feeds that he's getting from the West, and he'll have been given a lot of help in doing that and bringing it in. But he's old school as well. He's a commander by background. I know that from people that have talked to him, he would far rather be in the front line and fighting, rather than being the head of military intelligence. But he sort of fell into that by accident. But he's also very good at it. And this is why we're seeing not just him being very careful and developing his intelligence picture and allowing the operations on the ground to be properly intelligence-led, but we're also seeing an awful lot of other activities that are happening. So it wouldn't surprise me, there's no evidence in this is my personal assessment, but it wouldn't surprise me if he was behind the Russian nationals who are fighting for Ukraine, who carried out the small incursion into Belgorod, across the Russian border. It wouldn't surprise me if he's behind the drone attacks that we've seen going up towards Moscow and elsewhere. The one thing that he will be behind, and I think it's absolutely fantastic, are what I'm calling the Ukrainian Special Operations Executive Operations. They've got a lot of things going on in Russian-occupied territory and across inside Russia itself, where factories mysteriously catch fire, where individuals in the Donbass region who are supporting the Russians and are in political positions or head of the police in those particular areas and supporting Russian activities get killed in improvised explosive attacks. We see the derailment of Russian railway carriages carrying supplies, combat supplies down into Ukraine. We see different things just blowing up, attacks on airports, attacks elsewhere. All of this, I suspect, Budanov is behind. And again, he's giving us a masterclass on how to integrate not just what he's getting from a tactical perspective, but bring in that strategic intelligence feed that he's getting from the West as well, and then support everything that's happening on a tactical perspective with his operational level, special operations, Second World War type SOE operations going on behind, I almost said German lines, behind Russian lines.
You mentioned that strategic information feed that he's getting from Western allies, intelligence feed. Ultimately, how much difference do you think that will make, that support will make in the way that this war ends?
That is probably making a bigger difference than the supply of Western tanks, Western aircraft, and anything else, and is the one thing that people haven't realised yet. Part of the reason why the Russian attack on Kyiv at the very beginning failed was because Western intelligence had watched the Russian build-up across the border. There came a point in the Russian build-up where it was quite clear that this wasn't just another training exercise and threatening activity from Vladimir Putin. He had made the decision that he was going to cross over, and the Western intelligence was sitting watching where his vehicles were, giving the likely routes that they were going to come in, looking at where the helicopters were being deployed to, monitoring what was happening, and could make an assessment to say probably within 24 hours the exact time that they were going to cross the border and do everything else. That will have been fed into Ukraine, because Ukraine's response to the initial attacks were very well prepared, and they blunted the Russians in a way the Russians didn't expect. And again, this is happening, across the board. The capabilities that the West has in watching what's going on are absolutely phenomenal, and that is what is helping Ukraine at every turn. It's not the magic bullet. It's not and Western equipment isn't the magic bullet. It still gets down to a very guttural human on human activity at the front line, and it's absolutely horrific. But it is giving the Ukrainians an advantage over the Russians.
Philip Ingram, it's been great having you on Frontline. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.